Hello and welcome to the Masonic Authors Guild International. This is Robert L.D. Cooper with Mark A. Tabbert. We are Magi. Our mission is to promote the highest standards in education, research and publications relating to the global phenomenon of Freemasonry. The Duplicities of History, the Central Problem of Freemasonry, by Dr. Bob James of New South Wales, Australia. Part 1. Freemasonry as a single identifiable entity doesn't exist, and probably has never existed. The Grand Lodge of English Freemasonry, an organisation which probably began in the period 1717 to 1723 and claims to have mothered all other variants, is a distinct entity which asserted and gained ascendancy by the classical carrot and stitch technique. It offered benefits to memberships of otherwise independent lodges in return for oaths of loyalty and thus of a secondary position. Claims that it was made up of men of higher status who were therefore deserving of obedience from men of lower standing were no more than a refashioned statement of the divine right of kings. The mythical history of this Grand Lodge is full of delicious ironies. At the same time, the real-time history needs the mythology to help explain the order's global expansion. That initial Grand Lodge had no authority to determine either Masonic or political practice of any other Masonic entity, yet that is the nature of its achievement. Its claims of uniqueness and authority were part of a marketing strategy it needed because it was neither unique nor in charge. Why its self-defining Grand Lodge officers chose to act in this way is only the first of many questions, the answers to which determine how its subsequent 300-plus years of endeavour are to be interpreted. Over 3 centuries, something called Masonic history has been cobbled together by partisans from not very objective accounts of entities self-identifying as Masonic for political reasons and, it seems, for no other reason. How does Freemasonry come to be in European Australia's origin story at all? There are 2 reasons. The first is that in the 18th and 19th century extensions of the British Empire and English Freemasonry occurred together in a manner that must be construed as a codependent relationship which has genuinely been part of the European Australian experience. The second is that European Australian historians, who have tried to insert what they thought was Freemasonry into the European Australian story, have made the problem of false history worse. Like the conspiracy theorists who have wrapped the topic in negative views, they have used the mythical account rather than do serious research. So strong, apparently, was the mythology that they believed it could be taken as read. Their claimed pursuit of an origin story more accurate than the national narrative has added layers of confusion. Other than the obviously bogus claim of Freemasonry seeking world domination, then in the material labelled Freemasonry, Masonry, Pseudo-Masonic, found in European Australian museums and archives, there are 2 distinct threads. One relates to the creation of European Australians' modernist image, the other assists in the writing of an account closer to the truth. Neither is accurate, but both began with an invasion and a very long military occupation. European Australian scholarship on Freemasonry. A prominent and relatively recent European Australian Masonic scholar assumed that, quote, the early history of the craft in Australia coincided with the early history of Australian settlement, close quote. Interestingly, he allowed that the men involved, close quote, were, quote, individualistic, chauvinistic, bigoted, truculent, and were on some occasions malevolent gossips, close quote. But, he says, this is to be tolerated today as the natural capriciousness, close quote, of 19th century Englishmen who, incidentally, were not responsible for, quote, the savage brutality, close quote, of the convict system, but merely for its maintenance and oversight. These are generalizations of little more use than the myth. Pioneering authors on European Australia, James Matra and W.C. Wentworth, writing much earlier, don't mention Freemasonry of any kind. If they had, they would probably have connected stories popular at the time of US loyalists and Irish criminals to Masonic plots, and we'd now be celebrating an origin story in which oath-bound and shackled brethren and sisterin came ashore at Botany Bay intending to set up, quote, Masonic headquarters, Southern Region, close quote. They have disagreed about the results, but later serious European Australian scholars have insisted that something like this did happen. Quote, in 1797, following a meeting at the Freemasons' Arms Hotel involving some fellow officers and selected free settlers, the extraordinary influential junior officer, John MacArthur, formed an exclusive Freemason society. This secretive group had an all-pervading, if not sinister, influence in colonial affairs from that time on, close quote. Binney made no further mention of these plotters who, you'll notice, were not desperados, but, quote, exclusives, officers and free settlers, close quote. For the term of his natural life, by Marcus Clarke, published in 1874, is a story of a fictional convict, Rufus Daw, linked, quote, secret signs and their secret language, close quote, to, quote, a hideous Freemasonry of crime and suffering, close quote. A later collection of stories, The Ring, published in the 1890s by Prince Warang, another pseudonym, detailed an underground convict network supposedly in existence in the 1840s. It contended that convict lodge meetings included oaths of secrecy, secret signs and passwords, and that its organisation involved a hierarchy of concentric circles, the whole headed by the One. Another local scholar, Colin Roderick, bizarrely argued in 1950 that the Ring was the origin of Larkin pushes, that is, gangs, quote, that infested Sydney from the 1860s until 1918, and, quote, the packs of jackals that scavenged the camps of Australian soldiers, close quote, in World War I France and Sydney, and that Melbourne razor gangs of the 1930s and 40s. Perhaps the connection here is that the Larkin gangs were, quote, like contemporary lodges, close quote, with members having been nominated, balloted, initiated, and put on probation. The excitable Robert Hughes labelled conviction conspiracies on Norfolk Island the Ring and described it as, quote, a central mafia whose control of the lives of prisoners was both inescapable and minutely enforced, close quote. The same story surfaced again in 2003, attached to the suspected murder of an 1840s police magistrate on Norfolk Island by the name of Samuel Barrow. A fictional account of Botany Bay by Russell Schneider in 2019 imagined even Nepan, Under Secretary of State, recruiting well-known figures into his Masonic lodge before the first fleet sailed. Nepan insisted that the inductees swear to stand by the just-announced Commandant Captain Arthur Phillip in any trouble he might run into, whatever other allegiances they might have. The point for Schneider and the basis for the secret meeting was a belief that Freemasons could be trusted always to do the right thing, especially when British honour was at stake. A slightly more insightful but still conspiratorial attempt to understand was made in 2007. Quote, "This thesis examines the coexistence of traumatic themes and Masonic content in the work of contemporary visual artists. Recent research by scholars examining cult practices has indicated the existence of Masonic ritual abuse of children." Close quote. Research by the scholar Brunette led to a realization on her part of two relevant things: the importance of Freemasonry within Australian culture and an awareness of its failure to attract academic scholarship. She suggested that Freemasonry and all that is associated with it constituted a significant blind spot in academic research. Quote, "One of the consistent responses I have had when announcing the subject of Freemasonry as my research, there has been a particular laugh, as if the whole topic is some sort of a joke, a curious anachronism that bears little relevance to our contemporary experience." Alan Atkinson's 3-volume Europeans in Australia has been rewarded and acclaimed. In Volume 1, from 1997, he tries to make sense of the fraternal story, in particular that of the Freemasons, which he made central to his account. Unfortunately, he assumed that Freemasons always told the truth, including that there was only one entity of the name. He accepted at face value what they said about themselves. Quote, "No institution more thoroughly enshrines the value of liberty, equality, and fraternity as understood in the late 18th century," close quote, and so on. His excellent rendition of the modernist myth began with the notion that Enlightenment ideals, quote, "had been shaped by a polished and highly literate culture," close quote, and had been carried abroad, quote, "by powerful and cultivated minds such as that of Governor Phillips, whose successors continued the Enlightenment project by dispensing laws from a position of high humanitarianism," close quote. He implied early governors of New South Wales were probably all initiated brothers, since the Masonic ethos, once it had appeared, was suddenly everywhere. Quote, "A fraternal spirit showed in soldiers' collective land grants, especially where officers and men participated on equal terms. Masonic ideas might also explain the Corps' little war on Christianity, or at least on the evangelicism of the colonial chaplain," close quote. Ditto for merchants. Quote, "Freemasonry stood for a new ideal of frankness and mutuality among men, so that joint enterprise and investment abroad might issue from brothers' meeting places," close quote. The new ideal led directly, he said, to settlers gaining their own property, and since, quote, "property established interests, and interest led to active rights," close quote, and since growing rich was to grow more honest, quote, "nor was honesty only a private virtue. It included that business-like candour, that manly ability to speak, a virtue women might hope to emulate, which was the essence of Commonwealth," close quote. The Irish could not be part of his, quote, "polished and highly literate culture," close quote, so had to be otherwise explained, and thankfully for his thesis, they had reached the same conclusion. All Irish people were apparently semi-literate at best, and, quote, "unable to cope with the imaginary scheme of things, manifest in pen and paper, maps and terrestrial globes," close quote. The Defenders, an Irish oath-bound secret anti-government militia, among them, quote, "were bound to each other by a wilderness of catechisms and code words, memorized formula, invested with a kind of talismanic authority, as is usual among people who regard writing as a semi-sacred skill," close quote. Changed without explanation to Freemasonry. Quote, "Perhaps the Antipodean compass carried by Irish escapees was of this sort. Among Freemasons, as in the medieval church, the North Point had a powerful significance, close quote. After further remarks about the defenders' quote, web of imagery, close quote, mixing, quote, Catholic and revolutionary symbols, close quote, he made the same change to the same order. Quote, Brotherhood revived old millenarian ideas among the Irish. Ancient ideas of baptism and redemption were mingled with hopes of sudden liberty, close quote. After all, quote, Freemasonry was more popular in late 18th century Ireland than in any other country on earth, close quote. In her 2007 study, US scholar Harlan Jacob wrote about New South Wales, quote, as in British North America, a brotherhood that was initially identified with prominent men gradually broadened its appeal once rising men began to see membership as facilitating their upward mobility. Close quote. This in reference to, of course, Freemasonry. This is not a group plotting revolution or child abuse, but it's also not promoting, quote, scientific improvement, close quote, or, quote, the exercise of mutual benevolence, close quote, as she had previously claimed for the order. She is not describing Freemasonry as, quote, an association of men bound together in their struggles to attain all that is noble, close quote, as Freemasons have described themselves. What she is drawing attention to is social climbing, with the Masonic label as a stepladder.
This podcast is for educational purposes and perhaps entertainment. While the Masonic Authors Guild International provides the most accurate information possible, listeners use the information at their own risk. This podcast and its contents are Magi's property, as are all the opinions and the information it presents. Robert L.D. Cooper's, Mark A. Tabert's, and any other speakers' views and opinions within the podcast do not represent nor speak for Freemasonry, any Masonic organization, their former or current employers, in any way, shape, or form. Magi, Cooper, or Tabert will not compensate you in any way whatsoever if you ever happen to suffer any inconvenience due to the information herein contained.